Hello, guys.
Hi. Hi, Irfan.
Hi, Kujan.
Maru, do you know whether Paul is going to join today?
Paul will join at 10 a.m. We have an all-hands meeting from 9 to 10, so.
Okay, maybe we should get started then.
So, yeah, last meeting we were talking about some open pointers, which I thought of as problems or open pointers from, and some carried over from Federation V1. So, we actually did talk. If you look at the meeting notes, the agenda and meeting notes for Federation Working Group, we had around 5, 6 items. So there was one item about version skew. Then there was one item about which version the federated API should be using to federate to talk to federated clusters. There was an item about authentication and authorization, and there were 2 items. One was about defaulting, one was about validations, and the last one on the list was solution upgrades. If we need a strategy for same. So we did discuss until validations, and which we were still talking when we ran out of time. So we can continue forward to that. Yeah, so there was no clear solution for validations as of now, and the solutions proposed were mainly about letting the users of this API know that they might face failures in the difference in validations that might appear when template is submitted in a federated control plane, and that same thing is then submitted to a cluster. Uh, and I guess this might be okay to move forward as of now. We can talk about federation upgrades if we basically need an upgrade strategy, or we even need to think about federation upgrades as of now, given the uh, given the place federation API currently is.
I had a quick question about validations, and sorry, I think I missed the last meeting. Could you just remind me, maybe others, what exactly the problem with validation is? So it's not clear to me why
so
could not validate, given a spec, sorry, a template spec for whatever it happens to be, why would it not?
Yeah, I can explain that quickly. So what until we were using the same resource definition as KTest, which is the case in V1. All the defaulting and validation code was basically picked in for that particular version of the resource from the KTest API itself. When we include that particular definition as a template, which is actually a different definition, which is not necessarily the same type which is there in KTS API, because we are defining it here, it's how Golang treats the structure spec, right? So the same defaulting and validations do not apply to the template spec when we use it in the V2 API. So there are a couple of ways suggested. For defaulting, Maru found some mechanism which actually works around the problem as of now. So what he's doing is he basically uh, compares the version of the template resource with respect to the version that is created in the joining cluster or the federated cluster. So that's not necessarily a problem, but validations, the same validations which exist in the K8s API resource do not apply or are not done on the template spec, when it is submitted to the federated control plane. So solutions to that are like you can copy the same validations into the FCP API spec, but you'll be out of sync if anything changes in K8s APIs. It's not really a correct solution. The last time we talked about it, the solutions were like we just need to ensure that users know that this is a possibility, and the validations that happen or that do not happen in federation control plane can actually fail when the same spec is or the same resource is created in a federated cluster.
Okay, I think I understand your description, but I don't think I agree. Other than go, well, I mean, it seems like, irrespective of specific types in the API and how Go handles them and how our validation currently works, it seems like we have a template which needs to correspond with some version of the Kubernetes API with respect to mandatory fields and optional fields. And even the values of some of those fields are constrained in some ways, which is often what's done in validation. So it's not clear to me why we cannot encode in the federation control plane at API, at instance creation time, why we cannot validate some of those with essentially the same code. I mean, even if it involves taking the template that is submitted by the user to the Federation API and using that to construct a sort of dummy Kubernetes API object and passing it through the normal Kubernetes validator to verify that template is valid.
Yeah, we can do that.
But it doesn't seem conceptually like it's not possible.
Conceptually, it is possible, but the problem is that if you want to use the same validation code from the K8s API, then that particular code is not basically into a separate library. It is inside the core K8s, and that basically means you, just for that piece of code, either you vendor in K8s or duplicate the whole portion of code in the Federation spec.
But again, that seems like a reasonably easily solvable problem in the sense that we could work with Kubernetes folks to factor that validation code out into something we could vendor in. And again, it seems like a temporary problem rather than a fundamental problem, put it that way.
Correct. So the
I'm going to be the dissenting voice here. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not saying it's impossible, but this is like an internal detail of the API. This is not published at present, and that's not because it's because they want to be able to vary it, without necessarily exposing the internals. So the idea that they're going to publish it just for us, just so we can consume it, like that'll be a negotiation. I don't think that's a slam dunk. And the other concern is, well, yes, I can create the template, but what about overrides? Like, is the implication that I actually have to create every possible form of the resource, including its overrides, and I also have to take into account maybe the target version, because that can skew, like forward, but it still can skew. Member clusters may not have the same validation code. There could be latent issues with that. But I guess the concern wasn't so much that we ignore this indefinitely, it's that short term, there is not an easy fix. That's not to say that there is not a fix long term, but the complexity of the problem suggests that we don't have a way of just, this is what we're going to do, and maybe actually explore what sort of issues users encounter when we don't do validation up front. They're going to have to be able to examine the logs and detect propagation errors with whatever mechanism they end up using. Some of the errors may be extremely problematic. Some of them may be trivial and, papered over with documentation. But I think having actual user experience dictate what solution we end up with is preferable to trying to solve a really hard problem in the absence of that experience.
Yeah, I think those are reasonable observations. And I think the override stroke substitution problem is a real one, because I'm not sure. I mean, we can only do those once. We can only do the substitution override stuff once we've done the scheduling in many cases, and we can only do that once a bunch of other things are available in the general case. So I think that is a reasonable problem. And yes, there are certain problems which I think it's unavoidable will only be detectable once we try and propagate things to the underlying clusters. But I think it's also worth noting that the burden on the user is kind of fundamentally higher. So generating a synchronous API call error is easier for client applications to deal with in general, and also easier for users to deal with in general, than going and inspecting logs and trying to figure out what happened asynchronously as a result of a resource creation, for example, or update the Federation API. So I think where possible, we should try and do as much validation up front as we can, with the realization that we cannot do 100% of it, and they will, in some cases, need to fall back. I mean, I guess this problem is not unique to Kubernetes. This applies, sorry, not unique to Federation. It applies to Kubernetes as well. Wherever you have a template, and there are many of them, deployments, replica sets, etc., all have templates of other types in them. And
they have the advantage of having the validation code at hand. I mean, yes, there's a template, but I mean, they can do preliminary validation because they own the same code, because they're in the same API. Something I'm not sure that's documented, though, Paul mentioned that they kind of have a similar problem in Service Catalog, where I think they have a pod template for pod presets, and they're sort of facing a similar challenge in how do I validate this, because the code is not something that's exposed like for consumption at this point. So he was going to, they're kind of ahead of the game as far as like finding a solution for that. I'm not sure they have one yet, but the idea was that he was going to feed back their experience into the Federation development effort.
I'm sorry. I think I missed. Listing that point in the notes last time, Maru. I have added that now.
Great.
Yeah. So as I was saying, I don't see this also as something which we feel ourselves blocked, and we need to close this discussion. This can remain open for now, and we can take feedback from the users, and we can take inputs from, for example, service catalog guys if they find a problem, if they find a solution for the same. Do we want to spend a little bit time on that upgrades and our strategy for the same? Or I thought that I would anyways list that, because we were listing the open problems that are. Federation and API upgrades would also be something where we will need to define our strategy around. But we can delay this discussion also, or defer this discussion for a later date also. I mean, I don't find it very important to be talked right now necessarily.
May I say something concerning validation? Sorry, guys.
We were talking about validations.
Yeah. In the Kubernetes world, in the Kubernetes, there is a similar problem in this issue. The problem is validating a CRD, a customer resources, when inside the customer resources there is a Kubernetes resource, like a pod or a pod template. The problem is really similar to what we have here, and the guys are proposing a solution that is based on OpenAPI only validation. I'll let you go in through the issue when you have time. So if I understand correctly, what they are proposing, fundamentally they go to they use an OpenAPI builder, and then they use an OpenAPI as a validator. Now the real problem is OpenAPI powerful enough to validate Kubernetes resource? Probably the answer is no, but at least it's something that is better than nothing. But this will not solve the problem that was mentioned by Maru, in the sense that with versions queuing we will need different validation, if I understand correctly the problem. But anyway, this is just to add something to the discussion. When we have time, I would appreciate your feedback on this approach.
So, is this Dario that who was speaking?
Yeah, it is me. Sorry, I should open the video probably. I'm doing.
No issues. Maru, you were saying something.
Yeah.
Before you do that, Mario, I was actually just going to suggest, Mario, would you mind, Dario, sorry, would you mind just introducing yourself? I have not met you before, maybe.
No, we met previously. I work in Amadeus, and we are interested in the Federation in general.
Oh, great. Yes, I met you many years ago. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. And that's all. I'm not absolute. It's not absolutely clear to me if you understood what I said. But I was just proposing a way to partially solve the problem for validation that is based on OpenAPI static approach.
Sounds very reasonable to me. Yeah.
Okay, so I shared on the chat a link to an issue that is pretty similar to the problem that we have here. And the problem is trying to validate as customer resources when inside the customer resources there is a Kubernetes resource, like a pod template spec, like a job spec or whatever. So the problem is pretty similar, because when you create a customer resources, for example, when you create an operator, you don't have the Kubernetes server vendor, so you don't have the validation, and can be annoying in this situation. Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Just I didn't have time to test this approach on operators that we created internally in my company, but we are trying to do, and when we'll have time and the bandwidth to do that, we'll eventually try this approach. It's just to add some point of reflection on the problem.
That sounds great, and yeah, if you could give us some feedback when you do that to this group, I think that would be super valuable.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
Seems like it's an active area of research, but I think I'm hopeful that this will bear fruit for CRDs, because frankly, the future of Federation, in my mind, will eventually be CRDs, in which case we will be referencing Kubernetes types. And I'm saying that not to say we want to approach that now, because there's a lot of missing pieces, but in an ideal world, simple propagation is a matter of creating a CRD that references the type you want to federate, rather than having to generate code. You know, obviously extra special behavior might require more, but I mean, not just, if we could remove the burden of having to run a separate API server and just run controllers against Kubernetes, that would be ideal, I think. And that seems to be the direction that sort of the community around extending Kubernetes is going. They're not there yet, so we have to limp along the old way of doing things.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, Mauro, if you have time to have a look to this issue, I would appreciate your eventually feedback to understand to understand better about all this. Would appreciate your experience on this. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm kind of, as I said, like I think CRDs are kind of the future. I really don't know enough about them, but as we switch to a CRD approach for cluster registry, and also as Quentin, you pointed out many times, we are going to have to support CRDs, and so understanding them at a really fundamental level, I think, is key to this effort. So thanks, Dario, for
no problem.
pointing that out. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, going back to what we were talking about, I mentioned that one of the points that I listed was about condition upgrades. So what we basically need to think about, like we are probably in the process of implementation of, say, V1 Alpha 1 of, say, Federation Group. When we move to say V1 Alpha 2 or V1 Beta 2, what would be our approach for the same? And like in in the implementation, Federation implementation, which we call V1 right now, we had a slight problem in defining exactly what we call GA. I actually listed this point with respect to that also. Probably if we can define what we will call GA in future and how we will reach there, it might make some, it might help us in some way.
Yeah, I was involved in this in the Kubernetes world right in the beginning, and so I don't think Kubernetes is perfect in this regard, and I'm sure a lot of work has happened since then. But my general suggestion would be that we follow Kubernetes' approach as best we can, and if it's inadequate, we can certainly, do better, but at least do as well as Kubernetes. And the general approach there is, some degree of backwards compatibility, reasonably well-defined definitions of what alpha, beta, and GA mean. And those are written down already for Kubernetes, and I don't personally have an objection to what's written down at the moment, and we can just adopt that. Unless there's specific problems, and I can't see any obvious problems with adopting the Kubernetes approach as it currently exists.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think there's any issue with that. I mean, if nothing else, it serves as a great starting point. If it's too heavyweight for whatever reason, whatever area, we can always evolve it. But starting from that means we don't have to invent anything from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a very, very brief summary of what that is at the moment if anybody's interested. So first of all, alpha means, API is not firm and may change or be completely discontinued. And I guess you could call Federation V1 an example of that. Then beta is API is reasonably firm, no major changes anticipated. Implementation is not necessarily stable yet or production ready. But API, you can basically start developing against the API and not expect to have to throw all your code away, such that in the future sometime it will become GA and you will be able to run it in production. And GA means the API is firm, will receive some amount of backwards compatibility in the future, and the default implementations where such things exist, the controllers, etc., are considered to be ready for production use. Those are the basic meanings, and I think they make sense, and I think we can do much the same. We have perhaps an additional layer of complexity which we need to think about, but which I don't think is particularly challenging, which is we have this concept of which version of Kubernetes cluster do we support, or Kubernetes resource, and that's sort of tied in with this template, versus which version of the Federation API we call a given thing. And so I think we'll have to augment the Kubernetes approach with that aspect, but I don't think it's, needs us to rethink the whole thing. I think we just have to augment it.
What form would that augmentation take?
I think TBD, but basically we have this mapping that says Federation API, version so-and-so of a given resource type, whether it's alpha or beta or GA, would need to speak to some extent about what API versions of underlying Kubernetes clusters are supported, what the behavior is for those, and these kinds of things.
I think I'm trying to avoid that level of complexity, but maybe it's required.
I mean, if people are running these things in production, which we hope that they will and intend for them to do in the future, they need to know what the semantics are. So what clusters can they run underneath? And what are there any caveats? Does it work completely with this version of Kubernetes, or is it partially supported?
I think that's, I guess I think of that a little bit like the version supported in a template as being orthogonal to the version that will actually be used for a given cluster, because its version could be ahead of Kubernetes, or sorry, Federation, which would mean that maybe it would have a newer version. But at the same time, Federation would be talking, like say if a resource was v1 beta 1 when a given release of Federation came out, and someone deploys that, and then they're using the equivalent version of Kubernetes initially, and then they add a new cluster which is actually at a newer version and has v1, and it would be communicating via v1 beta 1, but then the actual resource that would be used would actually be v1 just because of the conversion mechanism in play. And I guess I'm not sure that that's a problem. I guess the implications are defaults. Like if I created a v1 resource, maybe the defaults could be different. Maybe the validation could be different. But I guess the challenge would be is that the controllers could have subtly different behavior across releases, and that may not be reflected in a version like that you could even track. Does that problem make sense?
Yeah, I think you can track these things with permutations of versions. The controllers are not magic, so given a given a Federation API version and a controller version and a Kubernetes API version, it's reasonably well defined what will happen and what is the intended and actual behavior. So just formalizing that is useful.
I guess I need more confidence that that's true. I have this suspicion that across Kubernetes versions, even though the API may be the same, there could be changes to the underpinnings of that resource and its related controllers that could result in different behavior. But maybe that's just me not being well educated on the issue.
No, I think that is true, and I think that is not intended behavior in the sense that if you Kubernetes, forgetting about Federation for the moment, so Kubernetes has this situation where a bunch of people write software that runs against Kubernetes clusters, and they don't upgrade their software in sync with Kubernetes or in sync with their Kubernetes cluster upgrades. So, Federation in that sense is actually just another client of a Kubernetes cluster, and Kubernetes has to provide backwards compatibility with its clients by definition, and has always intended and tried to achieve that. So to whatever extent that is not true, one can view that as a bug in Kubernetes. And, that's the kind of thing you put in release notes and you say, for this given version of Kubernetes, it actually doesn't provide proper backwards compatibility with for clients, and clients are going to break or behave in weird ways this time around. So be careful. And I think like I say, Federation is just a Kubernetes client in that respect.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I was trying to simplify the problem by like when, you know, Federation release, you know, 1.9 supports, you know, replica sets v1. And I guess the thing that I've been ignoring is, so the version of the Federation resource, like once we get out of alpha and it's something we're willing to support, would be v1 beta 1. And then the move to v1 may or may not, you know, actually change. Like, I guess for me, I guess I'm wondering if it would be possible to change, like, you'd be able to change the version of the federated resource like independently of the Kubernetes resource. And the only reason you would create a new version of a federated resource if there was a new version, like if there's a v2 replica set or a v2 beta 1, like as soon as it's not a v1 sort of, what would we call those groups? But as soon as it's not a v1 replica set and it's a v2, then we actually need an entirely different resource. But so long as we're dealing like with a v1 series replica set, the federated replica set, it could change the template type without necessarily having its version change. Does that make sense? Maybe something that has to be written
Not
down.
really, I don't think. I mean, I think if...
I'm just not sure why it's necessary to have like a matrix of like, this is what we support, when we're kind of relying on Kubernetes backwards compatibility anyway. And for a given like version, whether it be a beta or a full version or a, you know, a sub release or whatever, we could change the template freely, like within a federated resource, and not necessarily have to reflect that in a version change. And we would just, for a given like federated resource, Federation just supports whatever the maximum version it knew about when it was published, when it was released, rather than having to be, oh, we support, you know, v1 or. I guess I'm confused. Like, I guess my question is, are you proposing that Federation, for a given like version, that it actually like has documented support for different versions of the template? That's where I'm a bit fuzzy, I guess.
I think in theory it doesn't need that, other than to the extent that, you know, it supports all versions prior to this. But in practice, as you pointed out, Kubernetes does not always achieve its goal, which is to provide proper backwards compatibility. So wherever those situations arise, we will need to at least be explicit about them. So in theory, it's simple. In practice, it might be slightly more complicated.
Okay, so it's not necessarily like a call for we have to build in complexity. It's more like we have to be aware that complexity may exist in this area.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
And Maru, I sort of agree to what you are saying. I think we had this discussion earlier that at any given point of time, Federation can choose to federate the latest available version of the K8s API for that particular resource. And Federation's, the federated type spec can have a totally independent or orthogonal version with respect to this. And but the one simple problem is that because K8s version keeps progressing and Federation will also keep progressing, it might make some sense to just publish this information also with, say, a particular release that we make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just surfacing details that we'll have in the code anyway. And
yeah, yeah, you can say it that way also. Yeah.
I mean, for some reason, that's just triggering the thought that when we do have multiple versions of K8s resources, we're actually going to have multiple paths in our code to deal with it. Like,
but we are choosing at any.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but we are choosing that at any given point of time, Federation would be using only one version of a particular template resource, right?
Well,
so there'll be only one path for each resource type.
I guess I'm hoping that we don't ever. Well, I'm hoping we don't have two. Like, it's more like we're talking about V1, Beta 1, V1, Beta 2, V1, V1.1. Like, within a given release, what you're saying absolutely makes sense. I just had this shocking realization that there could be a V2 at one point, and then we'd have V1 and V2, and we probably would support them both. Probably a long shot that that's going to happen anytime soon, but I don't really like that idea for some reason.
The most complicated case that we actually thought of is that Federation, if it is used as a layer for users, then they would expect that they should be able to access all the available resources in a KHSLs, versions of the resource in a KHSLs. But we are totally, not thinking about that right now.
I mean, the funny thing is that, I mean, V1 beta 1 and V1 in a given API are the same resource. I had to check that assumption because for some reason I was like, wait, is that true? But I mean, when I'm in a given API, there's only one like namespace for that resource. It's not versioned, at least, I mean, within version 1. So V1 beta 1 versus V1, it's the same etcd resource regardless. There's just conversions so that you have API compatibility, but underlying storage is canonical. So I'm just kind of like, oh, if you had V2, would that change? I don't know. I don't think anybody is really thinking hard. Well, I shouldn't say I don't know. I haven't heard anything about the possibility of having a V2 that was actually a breaking change, because that would effectively mean you would need a different etcd namespace, like not a Kubernetes namespace, but you'd have a different hierarchy for a V2 resource.
For V2 API, for the storage, yeah.
There's quite a lot of thought that has gone into that. It's actually documented, and the answer is, I believe, unless it has changed since I looked at it a year or two ago, precisely that 2.0 of a given resource explicitly implies API breakage, so non-backwards compatibility with version 1, which is pretty standard in many products. It's not like too surprising. So yes, it might be called a replica set or a deployment in V2, but it is explicitly, you cannot, automatically convert a V1 to a V2, because there may be required fields in a V2, for example, that were not present in V1, and therefore your software that only knows about V1 resources will not be able to deal with V2 resources. Those kinds of things.
Yeah. So so if in the event that happens for any, assuming Kubernetes lives a long and prosperous life, it's probably inevitable. And it just means it's essentially a different resource with different controllers and different federated APIs to federate them. Okay.
Okay. The last pointer was about the control plane upgrades in case of active control plane, I guess. Like, so for example, you have released the V1 Alpha 1 of Federation, and you have active control plane, and you federate particular resources. You come to beta 2, there you have changed the version of the template spec which you are federating. How exactly do you expect users to upgrade from previous version to the new version?
Again, I would suggest that the solution right on the tails of Kubernetes, which has exactly the same problems, and solutions exist. There are conversions when you do an upgrade. The resources in etcd are upgraded. There's a well-trodden path here in Kubernetes, and we should just do the same thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of man hours or people hours that have gone into getting the upgrade story in Kubernetes, like shipshape. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel on that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we have some 18 odd minutes remaining. So do we want to talk about, we have that open item about converging to a common API. So I think Maru, you already did some prototyping around the 3 basic types, I guess. I mean the federated types. There'll be 3 apart from the template spec, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's, like, it seems we just kind of have a different philosophy I mean, and I'm not sure they're necessarily they're obviously it's just, you know, you can convert one into the other. It's not like they're not interchangeable, but I'm kind of wondering how best to move forward if, I mean, it could be we just have parallel efforts for the stuff where it's different. I was kind of hoping to have sort of a common objects that everyone could like be sort of emit or consume, and everything else could be different, but at least it'd be kind of like a lingua franca or whatever between them. But maybe that's just an unrealistic goal, and we can just focus more on design coherence, like in general. Does that make sense?
About a week ago, I think you and Paul were going to go off and try and reconcile at least the terminology and see where the fundamental disagreements were and which parts were just different words. Did you have a chance to have that discussion yet?
No, Paul's been pretty busy. It's hard to get his time.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to suggest that we go ahead, you know, semi-independently at this point. I think we've discussed what we can, and we've shared as many ideas as we can and come to as much agreement as we can. And now it's going to be a case of just, you know, building this stuff. So we're going to just move ahead with that. We'll certainly keep this group appraised of what we do and, you know, difficulties we run into or successes we run into, etc. But yeah, I think the effort to come to some consensus has kind of run its course now. So we'll just build stuff, keep the group appraised, and yeah, I think that's the best approach now.
Yeah, fair enough. I think I'm a little bit sad that there's not an opportunity to share more development effort, because I think if we're not sort of agreeing on the primitives, then, you know, the propagation thing that, you know, for Finord like represents, I think it's useful. I think it represents a certain amount of engineering investment, and we're probably going to continue making that investment. And if you're going to want to use different primitives, you're essentially going to have to either fork that or create something new, and it's not free. So
yeah, I mean, we'll use what we can, and we'll either fork it or we will change plans so we can I mean, it depends how valuable these things are. We can make those decisions along the way. I don't think we need to make them now. It's not the case that nobody will reuse anybody else's code, or nobody will, or, you know, everything will be forked and lost forever. We can do those on a case-by-case basis along the way. I think at this point we need actual code implementations of things that are useful and customers using them, etc.
yeah, okay.
You mentioned that you'll probably put out a proposal for some location, like you mentioned that there's a proposal mechanism which we can go ahead for getting a repo in the SIG Federation
Yes,
work?
there is. So I haven't actually had a chance to do anything with that. But in summary, I hope to be able to do it maybe this week. In summary, we just need to kind of clean up our act ever so slightly regarding the registration of our SIG and working group. I've now actually discovered that the definition of a working group is something that does not own code. And so we are actually now technically a sub-project. So a sub-project is a thing that owns code, and a working group is a thing that does not own code, apparently. You know, these are just terminology changes. So we just need to put that in a document and say, we are multi-cluster SIG. Here is our manifest. Here's how we do things. Here are, you know, all the basic kind of operational side of things. Once we have that, we can say, yes, we now have what I believe will now be a sub-project called Federation, and it requires one or more repositories under the Kubernetes SIGs organization in GitHub. and these will be approved, and we can then move forward with those. And we can have as many of those as we like, as we think are reasonable. They don't have to be production ready. They are basically places for people to collaborate, and they fall under the Kubernetes SIGs organization. So I can take a to-do to get all that sorted out.
So
that'll be amazing. That'll be amazing.
So Paul's just joined. It might be worth reiterating what we just discussed around.
No, before that, Maru, I have a suggestion to make. I think it's not necessary that we really have to work in seclusion. I think what you have done in FNOD is quite useful. And API-wise, if we can, multiple meetings I have suggested that at least what I would like to happen is that we converge on the API, and that API is kept or maintained in one single repo. And controllers could be there at different places, the implementation of controllers. So I know that API server builder works in such a way that it generally generates the controller scaffolding and the API scaffolding together. But would it be possible for you to just segregate the API and the controller separate in FNOD, or maybe create one more repo which is for controllers? And then we can probably take FNOD API as the base, and I can try to figure out where we differ and how we can merge the two together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm
because I
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. You can go ahead first.
I mean, I'm happy to try to have like a common API. If we're going to be using sort of different primitives, I'm not sure how useful the API stuff in FNORD is actually going to be, but having it be consumable, and I kind of take your point that API server builder doesn't really easily allow partitioning, and it may be that I don't know how to break it apart. But at the same time, I mean, there's nothing stopping us from just having a repo where we use API server builder and we generate crap that we don't use.
Yeah, that also is one way of doing it. Yes.
Yeah, we don't commit it, or we
just don't use
prune it before.
it.
Whatever it is. And I guess the only complication with that, no, I guess it doesn't really matter. I was just kind of like, I was puzzling over like, well, if we're not using API server builder, what yeah, I think it's a technical challenge. It's not something we can overcome, and maybe we can work with API server builder devs to sort of change this, because the other, it's not just, oh, but maybe it could just be the API server. So I guess my suggestion would be, the thing I'm sort of struggling with is if we had a repo where we were using API server builder to maintain the API, and maybe maintain the API server, and that could be a binary that we just consume as projects rather than consuming code.
Yeah, I mean, how exactly to do it, or what might be the best mechanism to follow to arrive at this, we can think about, like, take some time to do that. But what I meant to say was that probably, at least for the API, I would really like it to be converging at some place. And I am willing to work out, say, probably different abstraction APIs, which can maybe sync with what Quinton has proposed.
Right. The other possibility in the near term, while we try to work out the details of using API server builder in a way that it wasn't really designed, is simply working in the same repo and partitioning the work effort, like within the repo. Like the API would be common, we'd maintain the API the same, and then we could just have different. Like,
I get what you're saying. Maybe controllers could be multiple or different, or maybe separated in a different hierarchy. Yeah.
yeah, like different entry points, different controller hierarchy, whatever it is. But to me, I think that would be a better near-term solution, and we can just sort of agree on a partitioning in terms of like how we review, and if people want to have oversight over things, great. If the oversight isn't necessary, we can agree that you want to merge your code, you can merge your code, we can merge ours, like depending on what makes sense.
What are the areas of development that we're looking to parallelize that like precipitated this thread?
I think there's just a divergence in, like, I don't know. Quentin, how would you characterize it?
Sorry, I wasn't clear on what the question was.
Why are we not converging immediately?
Well, I mean, so we as when I say we, so the company I work for need to build something like this for real customers starting today. We can't kind of wait any longer. We've tried for 9 odd months to converge, and we've got some of the way there, but we still don't have a converged API, and I think that's fine. We tried. We I think hopefully have a better understanding of where the differences lie. So we're going to start building stuff now, and we will do as much of that as we can in the open, and people can use it or not, or make change proposals to it, and I think that's fine. And if there are other companies that don't want to use that or want to take a different approach, that's fine, and they can do that. But I don't think we, and at some point, one or other, some parts of these APIs will become more used than others, and more people will use some of them than others, and that's fine. But I don't think we can carry on forever trying to find a common API and not agreeing on it, because we're not going to get anywhere. So I propose that we draw a line now and say we've done what we can, we've spoken, we've understood each other's points of view, and now we're going to go and build what we can, and on a case-by-case basis, reuse or share or co-develop code along the way.
Okay, I mean, I can understand that. I guess my question would be, and Quentin, maybe this is something you and I can talk about offline, since there's 4 minutes left in this session, is like, what's the remaining delta to get to a place where we can all be looking at the same set of things? But I sincerely doubt that's a 4-minute question.
Yeah, and sorry, just before you joined, Paul, a week ago you and Maru undertook to go offline and try and reconcile some of the terminology. So if you recall, the document is kind of in 2 pieces at the moment. There's the first part that I wrote, and then the part at the end which Maru wrote about FNORD, and there is a discrepancy between the terminology and some of the stuff there, and it's not clear how much of that is actually fundamental disagreement, where we can perhaps have a constructive discussion about which one we prefer, and which of it is just different words used, or slightly different cut and pasted pieces of code. So I think that you can do, but I don't think we can like hold up development. Being the company I work for, so we can. Let's
talk about it offline. I mean,
yeah,
I don't want to hijack this meeting at the end of it. Sorry, I had another meeting I had to be in.
No worries. Okay, yeah, give me a shout whenever you want to talk. That's fine.
So let's circle back on Wednesday. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to talk, and maybe we can solidify some of the technical things that your decision implies.
Yeah, this might be premature, but I just wanted to put it out there briefly. So we're currently meeting twice a week, which may be excessive in the future. So maybe we want to talk about reducing that back to what we were before. We've sort of gone through the Kickstart effort. I think it's probably worth going back to, every second week or maybe once a week rather than twice a week.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I just like to make sure that we get things started first, but yeah, after that.
Cool.
Okay, and yeah, about the difference in the API, I think I mentioned I did go through Maru's implementation. I have seen the documentation. The primary difference there I see is in the level of abstraction. I think I did use the same words earlier. That's just some input to continue and Paul whenever you talk. Okay, I think we can end the meeting now. We are all almost out of time also.
Great. Thanks all.
Yep. Thanks. Bye bye.
Right.